This is our last week on Kierkegaard. I want us to deepen our understanding of what the religious life is for Kierkegaard, and I want us to make our final assessment of Kierkegaard's argument that the religious sort of life is the best sort of life to live. The first thing I want us to think about is this character that's described on pages 95, 96, and 97 of Fear and Trembling. So, Johannes de Silentio prefaces this description by saying he's never found a knight of faith, but he can imagine one. The character that's imagined goes for a walk around town, enjoys himself, decides to head home, and expects, upon arriving at home, a warm and delicious meal. This, despite the fact that the character only has 4 shillings to his name. It turns out the character doesn't receive such a meal upon arriving at home, and he's happy nonetheless. Now, Johannes de Silentio describes this character as a knight of faith, but I want us to reflect on that. The character certainly holds an absurd belief. He believes that he'll receive a meal that he can't afford. The character seems to be happy regardless of the outcome. He doesn't receive the meal, but is happy nonetheless. I think we should be skeptical as to whether this character really is a knight of faith. Remember, it's Johannes de Silentio who characterizes this figure as a knight of faith. And so I think there's a question about Kierkegaard's use of a pseudonym in this instance. The reason I think we should be skeptical that this character is a knight of faith is the object that this character directs his absurd belief at is a warm meal. This is the sort of object that's relevant in the aesthetic life. And moreover, the character that's described doesn't show any signs of feeling despair. Now, despair is the topic of the readings for today. And I think by thinking a little bit more about despair and the related feeling of anxiety, we can have a better understanding of what it is to live the religious life. So Kierkegaard describes anxiety as a psychological phenomenon. So it's meant to be an emotion or a feeling. Kierkegaard introduces anxiety by contrasting it with fear. The contrast is that when we're afraid, there's a particular discrete object of which we're afraid. For example, you might be afraid of the bear charging you. You're afraid that it's going to maul you. Anxiety, by contrast, Kierkegaard says, is a feeling about nothing. So the thought is, there's no specific or discrete object about which we have anxiety. In a way, we're anxious about no particular thing. But instead, Kierkegaard thinks we're anxious about possibility. Kierkegaard, what we're anxious about is the possibility of being free. Kierkegaard calls it the possibility of possibility, or the possibility of being able. So how does Kierkegaard understand freedom here? Freedom's our power to choose. But we've already seen that for Kierkegaard, my choice between chocolate and vanilla ice cream is not a real choice. So in choosing chocolate over vanilla, let's say, I'm not exercising my freedom for Kierkegaard. That's not what freedom consists in. Another sort of choice is an ethical choice. I mean, Kierkegaard admits that ethical choices are real choices. Here I'm choosing between something that I conceive of as right and something that I conceive of as wrong. So I might be choosing between lying and telling the truth. So is this a free choice for Kierkegaard? It seems that there's a sense in which it's not. Right? Once I've conceived of the world such that lying is ethically wrong and telling the truth is ethically right, then the choice is to tell the truth. Real freedom for Kierkegaard consists in choosing the ethical standards that determine for me what counts as right and wrong. So the thought here is that my individual ethical choices between lying and telling the truth, stealing and not stealing, these sorts of choices presuppose an ethical system, a system of values. And so the question is, how do I choose that system of values? This is where freedom lies for Kierkegaard. Precisely because it's this system of values that determines what counts as right and wrong, there can be no standard of right and wrong that helps me choose this system of values. So there's nothing objective that I can cite to inspire confidence in my choice of a basic system of values. And this is why, for Kierkegaard, I feel anxious about choosing my basic system of values. In our discussion of the ethical life, we saw that in choosing a system of values, I constitute myself. So in choosing, let's say, the system of values that dictates that lying is wrong, I make myself a truth teller. And so when I'm feeling anxious about my choice of my basic system of values, I am, in that same moment, feeling anxious about myself. I'm feeling anxious about the choice of what self I'm going to create. Now, I said that despair is a phenomenon related to anxiety. Despair, Kierkegaard defines in The Sickness Unto Death as the feeling of wanting to be rid of oneself. Right, so Kierkegaard introduces despair by drawing a contrast between despair and physical death. So the contrast is meant to be that physical death is the end of my life, while despair is the end of myself. So the thought here is that once I've constituted a self in my ethical life through a choice of my fundamental values, despair is no longer wanting to be that self, no longer wanting to be the self that I've made myself through my ethical decision making. Now, if you remember from our previous weeks on Kierkegaard, despair is meant to be the problem that comes up in the ethical life. Kierkegaard thinks it inevitably comes up in the ethical life, and that faith is the solution to the problem of despair. Now, in Stages on Life's Way, Kierkegaard characterizes the ethical life as a passageway, but he says that we never pass through it once and for all. And in Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard says that faith is a continual movement by virtue of the absurd. So the thought here is that in every moment of our lives, we have anxiety about the self that we've made ourselves. In every moment of our lives, we're in a position to despair over the self we've made ourselves. And so in every moment, we're called upon to have faith, to affirm the self we've made ourselves. Right? So to have faith would be to endorse the basic set of values that we've presupposed in all our ethical decision making. It's to feel that we can be happy with the ethical selves we've made ourselves. Okay, so in your papers for this week, I want you to think more about these related phenomena of anxiety, despair, and faith. And there's a worry that you might want to consider. The worry has to do with the lack of the objective standard by which one chooses a fundamental set of values. The worry is that if there is no objective standard by which one chooses a fundamental set of values, is it anything goes? Is there any limit or outer boundary on the ethical system that one can choose by which to make one's choices? So for example, white supremacy, fascism, are these ethical systems that one could adopt? Are they systems that one could have faith in? Could one become a white supremacist, feel anxiety about that fundamental set of values, and then instead of despairing over it and rejecting it, having faith in it, believing that one can be happy with that ethical system? It might seem that Kierkegaard is committed to saying yes to this, but then that might make us feel like his religious life isn't the best sort of life to live.